Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a restful evening and a good night's sleep and have now already up and energized to start the session this morning. Rather different subject matter this morning. We thought that having talked about some of the broad politics of immigration and of agricultural policy, that now we could turn to a subject that in some respects is closer to home, but of course also still raises some pretty broad issues that affect us all. So to talk about consumer regulation this morning, to try to answer some of your questions, we have again for you three speakers. First of all, we have Sue Davies. Now, Sue is the head of consumer protection and food policy at Which, otherwise known as the Consumers Association, which campaigns on behalf of consumers and of course is famous for the rigorous testing of consumer products that are reported in its magazine. Martin Lodge is Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the LSE and Director of its Centre for the Analysis of Risk and Regulation. And he's got a particular interest in how governments regulate economic activity in order to avoid and mitigate crisis. Probably a suitable subject at the moment, Martin. Finally, but not by no means least, Neil Warwick is Chair of International and European Union Issues for the Federation of Small Business, which provides services to and campaigns on behalf of small business. And he's also a solicitor in private practice, specializing in EU and competition law. So those are the speakers that we have for you this morning. Now, we've got a number of specific subjects to address, and that we will do, but that we thought that first of all, there are an interesting kind of general, a couple of questions coming up about regulation and business more generally. So we thought we would start off with that. So to give you an idea, Gary's group, how does a ban on energy efficient alternatives affect small business, and how are small businesses affected by consumer regulations that are put in place? And equally from Crescenzo's group, what is it that's keeping small business from recycling more and adopting cleaner options? So I think, Neil, that's probably a question that's got your name written on it, at least in the first instance.
Yeah, I think so. Interesting one, because we have done a lot of surveys on regulation, particularly, throughout the whole period of the transition from leaving the EU, and obviously during the pandemic as well. What we're finding is that a lot of our members mirror kind of consumer choices and follow consumers quite closely, and are quite often early adopters for sustainability and energy efficient things. I think the issue that we keep getting fed back to us through our surveys and through contact with members is that it's the cumulative effect of the regulations that causes the biggest problem. So if you bring in too many regulations too quickly, it becomes a little bit too confusing. And you couple that with the human effect, where many of our members are quite tightly run anyway, that they haven't got a lot of resource. So if you add in regulation on top of that too quickly, it makes it difficult for smaller businesses to keep up, basically.
How quick is too quick, Neil?
Well, I think, it's interesting times, isn't it, with the pandemic, and certainly living in a local lockdown area as well. I think, bringing something in at midnight with less than 24 hours notice is probably too quick, and it's caused a lot of confusion. In terms of the regulations, it really depends on what area you're looking at and what problem you're trying to solve. So going back to the original question of why did small businesses not recycle enough? I'm not sure that's entirely true of our membership, but again, there's a cost involved with energy efficiency. There's a cost involved with sustainability that takes a little while for people to adopt. So I think, months rather than weeks is probably the not very scientific answer I would have.
Okay, Sue.
Yes, thank you. I suppose it'd be useful to say at the start that I think the UK has generally always been quite good at consumer regulation, that while we've been in the EU, a lot of the initiatives that the EU has carried out in relation to consumer rights and protections have been driven by the UK. So we've always had a very good, solid base there. I think it's always a careful balance, because if businesses are subject to extra costs, then they have to pass those on to consumers. So you don't want to have unnecessary regulation, because it's not good for businesses and it's not good for consumers. But what we often find when we're looking at different areas, particularly where you've got sectors that have, a very diverse range of businesses within that, if you don't actually regulate for some of these measures, you don't have a level playing field. And then it can be very difficult for individual businesses to take actions on a voluntary basis. If you take recycling as an example, for example, you find that I think you need to have consistency in the way that that's done, because if every business decided to do their own thing and then you didn't have a common framework, it would be quite difficult. And at the moment, there's still a lot of challenges because different businesses recycle products with different labels, which is something that we think needs to be cleared up and made simpler. So I think it's a careful balance, but often in order to drive change across a particular industry, and particularly when we're dealing with something like climate change in relation to the focus on energy efficiency of different products or recyclability, by actually regulating, then you make sure that it's not just those leading players who can, want to be competitive in that area, but you're bringing up the whole industry. But I completely agree with Neil, when you're bringing in regulations, obviously you can't just bring in changes overnight. You need to make sure that businesses know what's expected and that they've got the time to comply within a reasonable period as well.
Martin.
I also agree with Neil to make it sound quite funny, but no, I think I think particularly this point, there's always this kind of argument about at some point regulation is used by the large companies to basically suppress, you might say, kind of smaller businesses, because they either already produce their technology or they have more resources to comply or to change their way of producing goods and so on. But I think that is sort of a sector by sector experience as well. But and Neil would know much more about examples than I would. But I think the key point here is I think sort of the aggregate burden of regulation. So when we sort of do research on what do people want from the local inspector, so to speak, it's not sort of the rule book thrown at them. It's basically that the engagement with, let's call it, bureaucracy is one about sort of how to learn about sort of the updating of regulation. So it is much more about a learning and sort of more engagement between small business, for example, and local authority and so on. And I think that has been a particular problem in the in an age where inspections and sort of encounters between small businesses and regulators have been declining, when people actually want more engagement, but not necessarily of a, let's call it, a deterrence, kind of do you follow the rule way, but rather more in a sort of learning and supportive advice giving rule. And indeed, then, Neil's example of here's a rule and follows this in 24 hours time, and we don't even know that it exists because nobody talked about it. These are sort of the examples that don't help. But again, all of these better regulation tools exist in order for this not to happen. It just requires then an executive to follow these so-called better regulation tools as well.
Okay, if just throwing at you a general question that might be helpful to people. Where does the UK, so far within the framework of the European Union, stand if we were to have a league table of, the extent of consumer regulation? Are we, by international standards, quite heavily regulated or not so heavily regulated? Where would you say we might stood if you were asked that very broad question?
I think it's probably one for me to start again, I guess.
Okay, all right. And then I was particularly hoping that Martin might give us an idea of where we sit on that.
Well, certainly from the early adoption of consumer regulations within the EU 28, as it was, the UK is consistently in the top three. So the top three countries that adopt quickly tend to be Holland, Germany, and the UK. And whilst you know, you see a lot of the popular press complaining about the red tape from Brussels. As a country, we, you know, Sue said, we've led on a lot of the consumer regulations and bringing them in the level playing field, and we're usually one of the quickest countries to adopt them as well.
So would you be expecting as an organisation, when we've left the European Union and can set our own regulations, that we will become less regulatory than we have been so far?
I think it's an opportunity to look at and review regulation and see what is working and what isn't, and where the burdens are. I would be nervous about ripping the rule book up completely and starting again. I mean, not least because everybody would have to relearn a new set of regulations. And, you know, I think deregulating, certainly from a small business perspective, favours larger businesses rather than smaller businesses.
Okay, Martin, sorry, that was the question about where do we stand in the league table. I was particularly aiming at you, maybe unfairly.
Well, you know, it's okay, I'll you know, so indeed, sort of as Neil highlighted, I mean, if one looks at transposition, I think the UK has already looked, you know, had the right administrative machinery in place and always looked quite, you know, in a good place. You know, I think nobody has actually sort of, you know, let's say, done a study about sort of different sectors and how it feels when you sit in your home and, you know, kind of where do you get redress and all that sort of thing. And again, I guess sort of in different consumer markets, we might find sort of slight differences, but that would be a beautiful, I think, piece of research to do. And maybe Sue knows more about sort of comparative experiences of, you know, what happens to me when things go wrong in different countries, right? And but I think also, I think sort of the question is, you know, when it comes to sort of the transposition, and I think that's, you know, there's sort of two things about your second question there to Neil about sort of the intensity and so on. So I think sort of the, you know, I agree that, you know, I think we will have, you know, so there will be, let's call it a sort of a schizophrenic demand. On the one hand, you know, things should change just to show that, you know, kind of Brexit has happened. At the same time, I think there'll be a lot of call to maintain certain standards, one by business, because they would like to have consistency and predictability and so on, rather than things being thrown up. And I think at the same time, I think also consumers would not like to see sort of things just disappear. I mean, I once did a, you know, I mean, this is supposed to come back, the so-called red tape challenge, which was all about sort of tell us online what sort of the burdens on you were, people, you know, or businesses and such like. And when one actually looked at sort of the different contributions to this red tape challenge, the dominant concern was to actually enhance regulatory standards, or, you know, to create boundaries, you might say, rather than sort of radical deregulation. So I think there will be an interesting kind of battle between a political, you know, kind of government at this point, which is very much for, you know, set rules free, so eliminate them, and you know, you might say an overall demand to maintain, if not to enhance, consumer regulation.
Okay, Sue, did you want to come in on this, or?
Yes, please. I mean, I would agree. I think that we have generally gone further in quite a lot of areas. We work a lot with consumer organisations across Europe and globally, and I think the UK has a very good reputation in this area. We introduced a new Consumer Rights Act in 2015 that strengthened protections at a national level. There are examples of where we have protections that other European countries don't. So one is a right that a lot of people are using at the moment, where under the Consumer Credit Act, you have a right to claim your money back from credit card companies when it's over £100. A lot of people are having to do that at the moment in terms of getting compensation for cancellations or other events. I think one of the challenges is often the actual compliance and enforcement. So there's an issue that you might have all of these rights, but then it can sometimes be quite challenging to actually get them in practice. So flight rights is one where you've got the rights, but sometimes airlines will just not give you your money back, and that's a particular difficult issue at the moment. But there's also areas where I think it will be interesting after we've ended the transition period, where we have these rights at the moment, but if you're buying things across borders, so if you're buying things from the EU, even if we maintain the rights that we've got at the moment, it will be quite difficult to actually enforce those in practice. So rather than going to your local trading standards department, you might have to pursue some of these rights. If, say, you buy a faulty good, or your holiday gets cancelled and the company's based in another EU member state, you might actually have to go to that country and pursue that through their courts rather than here. So that's where there might be some complexity in particular that will arise.
Okay, well, thank you, Sue. That's nicely cued us into the first of the specific topics we've got to cover, which is the issue of airline compensation. We've had quite a lot of questions about this. Let me at least initially pick 2 or 3 out. So, general question from Angela's group, aren't airlines insured against delays and cancellations? Why should consumers take on these costs? Coming from the other end of the perspective, from Hannah's group, what travel protections currently under European Union laws are covered by travel insurance companies and the Consumer Credit Act, i.e. do we therefore need the flight cancellation regulations to remain in force? And then equally also, I mean, how is COVID going to potentially impact on this, and given particularly the impact of COVID on the airline industry? So let me start with those 3. And Sue, would you like to kind of respond to some of these points?
Yes, I think we're seeing with COVID that your protection varies depending on exactly what sort of holiday you've booked. I think the denied boarding regulations is something that as a consumer organisation we've really supported, because they mean that if the flight is cancelled, you have the right to get your money back, but also you get the right to compensation, and you get the right to things like your accommodation being covered and meals being covered if you're left stranded. So that's something that is an important protection. And at the moment, I think regardless of when we leave the EU, that will continue if you're flying on an EU airline in any case. The government has sort of temporarily, with all of the legislation it's carried over, applied that at the moment to UK airlines as well. But it's always been a contentious area with airlines where they've really resented it, and in many cases have refused to pay people the money that they're entitled to. So that's something which often has to get involved to try and make sure that people do get their money right back. It's also been complicated with COVID because a lot of holiday companies under package travel regulations are obliged to give people their money back, but then they're struggling to get the money back from the airlines to then give to people to pay the money that they're owed. And you see some really different models in terms of the actual reserves that some of these travel companies have got, where some have been able to refund people. So we've held up, say, Trailfinders or Kioni as some of the ones that have been doing this well, whereas others are just not refunding. And it's very difficult then as a consumer to actually get your rights enforced. So I think that there's different variations of protection depending on if you're just buying a flight or if you're buying an actual package holiday. I mean, it's hard, obviously things are really in the air at the moment, but a lot of people will be buying maybe a flight and then going away and booking accommodation separately. So we think that this regulation does give you very valuable protections that isn't covered elsewhere.
But I think, Sue, one of the questions at least was going in the direction of, well, isn't this just simply a risk that we as individuals should insure ourselves against, rather than expecting what might now be thought to be a financially challenged airline industry to continue to carry?
I think it's a really difficult issue, and as which we've had a lot of discussions about this, because obviously, you know, it's a terrible situation for the travel industry, and you know, we want to make sure that those businesses survive. But then as you as a consumer, if you have lost your money and it's completely out of your control because your flight has been cancelled, you might also be furloughed, or you might be have a mortgage holiday that's coming to an end, and you need that money back because that's quite important. You haven't gotten on a holiday, your flight hasn't actually happened. So that's where I think we've called as which for the government to set up a travel guarantee fund, which is something that some other countries like Denmark have set up. So I think it's something where it shouldn't be on the onus of the consumer's money to be held up in that system, even though it's a very difficult situation for the industry. That's something where that support has to come from somewhere else so that consumers can have the money back when they really need it at the moment.
Okay, Martin.
So yes, I mean, I think, I would follow sort of on Sue's line that, a system such as this, where, I don't think a market can work if the consumer has no confidence that they're going to get their money back, and sort of stories of messes occur and all that, right? I mean, we have that in many a market. If people don't trust that they'll get their money back, or they'll get screwed over and so on, I think this will not be, there won't be any confidence in that in the first place. Now, the slight problem, of course, is when one sets up these sort of special funds and so on, which to compensate consumers, at some point, there will always be the stories about fraudulent activities and so on, and sort of how much administrative burden do you want to sort of put on those in order to sort of make sure that there's no sort of, creative use of these funds by certain parties. And I think that was sort of something to watch out on. And at the same time, also, how temporary or permanent will these sort of arrangements become, right? I think that would be sort of another kind of question. But I think that is sort of, I think that is where I think consumer, the consumer side of kind of regardless of COVID, I think it's sort of, I think sort of businesses have an interest to signal to their potential consumers that they can, that they, especially in a COVID world, that basically they're not sort of going to sink money into some complex arrangements that might never happen. So I think, I think that will be sort of an incentive also on the business side to at least signal support, even if when it's applied, it's extremely horrendous when it comes out. And I think Sue has given some examples that I personally experienced myself here. So yeah. And certain websites not highlighting that you have EU rights, for example, and sort of pretending there's only one sign rather than another. And these are supposedly British flag carriers, right? So, yeah.
Okay, Neil, I don't suppose you've got any airlines who are members of FSB, but maybe I'm wrong. But doubtless your members may still have views on this subject.
Yes, I was going to say a lot of our members have taken advantage of a lot of these schemes. And I think in a very simplistic way, if you look at it, if it wasn't there, how difficult would it be for smaller businesses, individuals to make these claims? And I can say from personal experience, having had to sort this out for my parents earlier last year, even with the rights, it's quite a complicated system, and if you've got a lawyer who's been practicing for over 25 years, struggling to get through the regulations and finding hurdles simply to get his parents' compensation, then, I'd dread to think what it would look like without these protections. The bit that I thought was quite interesting with your introduction was the question about insurance and the impact of COVID. And I think that's going to be a big topic as the economy starts to recover, because, are the airlines insured? Big question. Nobody really knows, because at the start of the pandemic, you could have relied on certain provisions in the insurance contracts to say this was an unforeseen event. You can't do that now. So there's all sorts of backwards and forwards arguments between insurers and airlines and insurers and consumers. And I think this is an area you will see a lot of change in very quickly as the insurers look to step away from pandemic cover, basically.
Yeah, and presumably the argument about business disruption insurance also applies to the airlines. Presumably some of the airlines may be hoping that some of their business disruption insurance would have covered them for some of the costs of COVID, and they don't as yet know whether they're going to get it covered or not. Is that right, Neil?
I think there's an element of that, but there's also an element of, with the business interruption insurance, that was a market that changed quite dramatically after the financial crash. And sometimes with some policies, you actually have to specify that you want that insurance now. So I think a lot of people took out insurance, post-financial crash, thinking they were protected. And, the small print that the lawyers like to put into contracts has defeated them. Okay, all right. Thanks very much on that. The other kind of issue of what do we do when we're abroad that we've got is the question of mobile roaming. So the broad question that's been asked here by more than one group is there a genuine cost to mobile operators when customers roam abroad? So, does it actually really cost the companies money if people use their using their mobile phone when they're abroad, or are they simply charging for international calls in order to make a profit? And then Curtice's group asked this rather specific question about, well,
how is the UK government empowered to get providers in other countries to agree to keep the roaming arrangements, i.e. even if the UK government were to say, we don't think to say to O2, we don't think you should be charging, is that something that's enforceable given that O2 is reliant on the services of other European companies? So Martin, is that something you can start us on at least?
Well, I think sort of, the real cost to a company which is trans-European and as a result of which can sort of do its own, so it is very difficult to establish exactly what the true cost is. And regulators have been battling on that front for quite some time as well. And I mean, I can look at sort of history too, where in the old days of monopolies, the international settlement rate was exactly where all the companies made all their, basically cross-subsidize their domestic services. So there's a long tradition there of sort of trying to use transboundary calling to basically subsidize their own domestic business. So in that sense, I don't think there's exactly a number, and it will vary between sort of different providers, and it also depends on whether you own the net, have the network, or you buy some capacity there. So I think sort of basically the key issue there will be more the contractual relations between different providers and so on will sort of determine the cost. I mean, more broadly, I think this is largely in the hands of the operators, and I suspect what will occur is that certain bundles might emerge that will sort of provide you with sort of roaming costs and such like. I mean, I think that would be sort of where it comes from, and that's where it sort of will send, where it will end up in.
Okay, Neil.
I think addressing the question, is there an actual cost? Typical lawyer's answer, it depends. So yes, I mean, some networks will be using other people's infrastructures, so there will be an actual cost. And largely speaking, this is why the roaming charges were kind of introduced, imposed, regulated by the EU. And dealing with the second question, can the UK government impose anything? If we've got a free trade arrangement that deals with this with the EU, possibly. If we don't, no. It's like Martin says, it'll be down to the contractual arrangements between the various networks and operators, and will become far more complicated.
So just to follow that up, Neil, so Crescendo's group asked a very specific question, which you've begun to address, is, is there an alternative regulation that the government could introduce to contain the cost of international roaming? So I guess one route you're saying is, if we're going to do it via the European Union, it needs to be part of the free trade agreement. But the alternative question is whether or not it's simply possible to regulate the charges that British companies make for people using their phones abroad, without it necessarily being tied up with the European Union.
You could attempt to, but then this goes right to the heart of the overall negotiations about the exit of the EU. Is that a level playing field? If we regulate too tightly and impose conditions on effectively companies that are trading within the EU that makes it unfavorable, then that's when the EU might object to it. So, we either have alignment or we don't.
Okay, Sue.
Yes, when the Roam Like at Home regulations came in 2017, the way that it was able to be done was that there was an agreement on the actual costs at a wholesale level amongst the different providers. And I think that's what the challenge is, because the government could require mobile phone companies, as you say, to limit their costs, but they're reliant on those networks in other countries. And for some it will be much easier because they might operate in lots of different EU countries. Others might have relationship with other providers. So without being linked into that agreement with the EU and being part of that system where the costs are set at a regular level, there would be lots of different costs, and then there could be knock-on effects in terms of the competitiveness of those different phone companies and the level to which they were able to invest in other services and what they offer consumers as well. So some have said that they will maintain it on a voluntary basis, but not all. It's partly about regulation, but it's really about having that trade deal. And we also, we've been trying to get the government to put it on the agenda for trade negotiations with other countries as well. We've just done some research, like we're agreed a deal in principle with Japan, for example, and it can cost an absolute fortune for the data you use in Japan or in America. So it's, can you get those sort of agreements with those countries as well? But again, it's not regulating the company, it's about having to get that agreement at a country level as well.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. So apart from these two issues about, as it were, our lives abroad, we've also got a number of environmental issues about life at home. And the one in particular that's generated a lot of questions is the question of the use of plastic. Let's just start off with 2 or 3 of them. An interesting one from Angela's group, which in part cross-refers to our discussion about agriculture yesterday. And it says, could the public money for public goods approach be used to incentivize a reduction in the use of single-use plastic? And just in case this isn't familiar to you, the public money for public goods approach is what's being used, or in England at least, to subsidize agriculture once we've left the European Union. The idea is that basically farmers will be paid not to produce food, but to look after the environment of the land that they are farming, and we pay them for the public benefit that derives from the fact that they manage the land effectively in a way that's environmentally sustainable and all the rest of it. So the question is basically, could we use some form of subsidy in order to encourage the reduction in the use of single-use plastic? And then, similar vein, more than one group has asked about, well, what are the alternatives to plastic, including particularly, is paper necessarily the only alternative that faces us? So basically, therefore, are we stuck with plastic, or would it be possible for us, in fact, to move on? So Neil, can I start you off with those couple?
Yeah, I mean, your sort of cohort are going right to the heart of a lot of the debate about.
Oh, we have lots of very clever participants, Neil. Yes.
Yes.
This is the great British public that you are speaking to.
I mean, and again, this goes to the what kind of deal are we going to have with the EU? Careful what you wish for. One of the knock-on effects that we're going to see with the packaging side of things is that a lot of natural packaging, if you like, wood and certain cardboards, will be governed by phytosanitary rules in the EU, which will make it more expensive potentially to use natural goods for packaging, which again will drive a push towards plastics.
Can you explain, Neil, why that's perhaps you could explain what you mean by psychosanitary and explain why cardboard gets wrapped up into that whole world?
Well, some cardboard, and I'll come back to that. But phytosanitary rules are the rules that govern plant life. So whenever you're in an airport and you see a sign saying "Don't import plants," it's about the rules of certain diseases that can damage plant life. Because natural packaging products derive from plant life, those rules govern them. So you'll have to have all wood packaging treated and marked accordingly if you want to send it to the EU, and certain very heavy cardboards will be caught, some won't. So, basically, if we don't cover that off in the free trade agreement, it probably drives exporters to look for the lowest common denominator, which would be some kind of man-made synthetic packaging, which obviously, as we all know, is damaging to the environment. Coming back to the question, the very specific question about the public money for public goods, and I'm very pleased that you used the term subsidise, because that will go to the heart of the state aid argument that we're having with the EU at the minute, that if we over-subsidise to the point that we're benefiting a particular sector, like agriculture, that could be seen as a state intervention, and again goes to the heart of the argument, well, is that a level playing field? So I think a lot of what we can do on our own regarding plastics and the environment will be driven by whatever free trade arrangement we get.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Sue, again, can I pass it on to you and kind of include into it. I mean, if you may or may not know anything about this, but you know, as a consumers association, you might. I mean, is there any reason for us to be concerned? Something Andy's group raised about the health implications of wrapping food in plastic and the use of microplastics, and the fact that the fish that we might eat might have microplastics in them. I mean, is this a subject about which we should be concerned as a society?
Thanks. I mean, I think, yes, it is something that we should be concerned about, and is clearly a big driver of policy from this government as well as from the EU with the ban coming into effect. As Neil was saying, there are rules in place at the moment, these food contact materials regulations, which basically are designed to make sure that you're not using packaging that could actually harm your health, but often it's very difficult to know what all of those effects are. And I think we have to make sure that some of the alternatives that we might switch to, which might appear natural, don't have other safety issues as well. But I think there is clear evidence around the level of pollution and the impacts around single-use plastics. We've done a lot of surveys. We did one recently looking at different types of products within supermarkets and just how much they were using, the sorts of plastics that they were using in their packaging, and how much of that was actually recyclable. And so I think there's real differences in terms of company practices at the moment, and the extent to which some companies are taking this more seriously than others. And I think the government needs a mix of different incentives to shift businesses. I mean, I think, you know, we've got a big environmental conference happening next year that the UK is really leading on in relation to climate change, also a big conference on biodiversity. So it's a thing that the UK is trying to show a lot of global leadership on. I think part of it comes down to how you regulate. I think you're thinking around the public money for public goods, you know, is a really interesting idea. Farming is interesting because one of the few sectors where there is government money to farmers, and at the moment that has, as you'll know, hasn't really been given with very clear indicators for what it's got to be spent on. So the more that it can be used in that way is positive, and I think you can do that to improve food safety as well. I think how you apply it to other sectors is probably more complicated, and is probably a matter for regulating and making sure that there's investment in safe alternatives so that businesses can easily swap to those without huge cost.
So can I just put a very specific aspect of this debate to you? You know, when my mother went shopping and shopped for potatoes, they got put into a paper bag, right? These days, if you go shopping, it goes into a supposedly compostable plastic bag. I mean, does the Consumers Association have any views about what packaging should be used? For example, the purchase of loose goods.
Well, I think it is about phasing out plastics and giving people alternatives to that. I mean, I think the ban on, or the charging for plastic bags has a huge impact, hasn't it, on the number of bags that are actually used and are ending up going into landfill and ultimately ending up in the sea. So these sort of initiatives can have a really big impact long term. And I think it's partly about how it's about having the alternatives and making sure that those alternatives aren't inadvertently more damaging than the actual thing that you're trying to ban. But it's about how you influence behaviour. And I think things like the charge for plastic bags seems to have had a big impact on people's behaviour. So it's how can government use a wide range of different incentives that isn't all about putting it on the consumer, but about driving that change throughout the whole supply chain as well.
Okay, Martin.
I mean, I don't want to repeat everything. I mean, one of the biggest puzzles I always have as a half German is why in West Germany I paid for a plastic bag in the 1980s and I had to wait until, you know, nearly the late 2010s to get it around here, right? And I think that's an interesting question about, you know, what is it, you know, so you know, I don't want to repeat the kind of the problems about, you know, kind of, you know, state aiding, you know, a certain technology which might possibly be politically better represented than another type of product, right? So it's all these kind of questions there. So I think ultimately, you know, I think a bit like what Sue says, it's going to be sort of a mix between, on the one hand, I think consumer demand for, you know, alternative packaging, but also at some point sort of some punitive measures to basically deter the use of certain kind of packaging. I think it will have to be these kind of two elements. And you know, and I think that is the only way in which this kind of issue can be resolved, in my view. But I think as long as people don't want it, as long as the social norm doesn't exist, I think it doesn't really change much. And I think that's just sort of a COVID part of this. You know, I notice in my own employer that everything is turned into plastic at this point, and I think there's sort of another kind of question about how do you you know, how do you move out of a state of, you know, exception in the loosest sense of the word exception, you know, to a sort of world where you want to sort of move towards a removal of plastic again.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, so we've got a couple of issues which have occasionally caused a certain amount of controversy. Powerful vacuum cleaners and light bulbs that actually work. So let's start on vacuum cleaners. A couple of groups, including Claire's group, have asked, well, why have we picked on vacuum cleaners in particular? Why have we picked on corded as opposed to cordless vacuum cleaners in particular? I.e., is this something that, if indeed we think we should be regulating the amount of energy that consumer goods consume, is this something that should be applied more widely? So, Sue, why is it vacuum cleaners upon which the European Union has focused hitherto?
It isn't actually just vacuum cleaners. There's quite a long list of products that they've covered in the what's called the eco-design regulations. So that includes everything from light bulbs, cookers, televisions, computers, fridges, tumble dryers, a whole list of products. And the focus is on trying to set limits for how much energy is used in order to make them more efficient in terms of energy. But also looking at issues like what sort of materials are being used and can those ultimately be recycled, and are the businesses looking at the whole life cycle of those products to try and make sure that they are making them as efficient as possible, and also about reliability of the product. So this has been a thing that the EU has been phasing in over some time. Interestingly, the government has actually just had a formal consultation, well, I think they called it a call for evidence, on whether or not the UK, after the EU, so precisely what you're talking about, should maintain these regulations, and or should it actually be looking at extending it to even more products? So should it be looking at things like microwaves, for example, or hobs that aren't actually on that list at the moment? The reason why it's only been applied to vacuum cleaners with cords rather than cordless ones, I think, is a technical issue that they haven't worked out how to apply it to the cordless ones yet, but it's something that they're still working on. And with the energy label as well, it's been, I think, particularly challenging in how you apply the energy label to vacuum cleaners. But that's something that the EU has initiated, but the UK is also asking, can we actually improve on that and make it work better? And I think we certainly know that it can be quite confusing sometimes when people see the energy label to actually know what that means for a particular category.
So just to clarify, Sue, so you're telling us also that it's not just that we struggle to buy a vacuum cleaner that sucks, but we might also find it difficult these days to find a tumble dryer that dries. Is that fair? Or I mean, why is it that vacuum cleaners in particular have kind of been the subject of press attention?
Well, I think there's probably a perception that you were compromising on effectiveness of the product for the, reducing your impact on the environment. But we've done lots of testing on this now, and it's not actually the case. Some of the ones that use the least energy can actually be some of the better vacuum cleaners. So it's not related to performance at all. So I think that was perhaps a bit of a myth, which around the time when it first came in.
Okay, all right. We won't ask you for the which best buy on vacuum cleaners. That's probably good.
Well, I did actually check because I thought you might have. So it was the best under £200. I can't tell you the price of the exact model, but it's AEG, Miele and Dyson were the ones that were the best buys when we looked.
You mean Mr. Dyson, who's been opposed to these European Union regulations? Testing. Oh well, there we go. Neil.
Yeah, I mean, echo everything that Sue said about the environmental side of it. And it's not just vacuum cleaners, but I suspect that's a nice, easy label for the press to hang something on, and it affects all of us because every household has a vacuum cleaner, etc. It's a bit like the sort of straight banana jokes and all those sort of things. But it is also about standardization. you know, and that goes across the piece for the question about the vacuums and the light bulbs, that, you know, if you order online a vacuum cleaner from France or Germany or Spain, you want it to be performing to the same standard as the one you can buy in the shop in the UK. So a lot of EU regulation is driven towards standardization. So you've got this level playing field, but it is also fair to say that, you know, not everything about the EU is perfect, and they do get a kind of cause célèbre or cause of the month. And, you know, kind of environmental was something that was very big in the last multi-annual assessment. So I think there's a lot more focus on that area than perhaps other bits and pieces.
Okay, Martin.
And I think, you know, just drawing from this, I think this is an area where I think there will be very little demand for regulatory divergence. I mean, why would you as a vacuum cleaner company want to, you know, produce to a different standard to the UK customer? You know, I mean, why would you not upgrade, you know, your own products, or only, you know, send your bangers to the UK and, you know, have the nice and efficient vacuum cleaners or light bulbs going elsewhere, right? So I think, you know, that's sort of an area where I cannot see, you know, kind of a divergence happening from a business side. But what I would say, and that's partly already going to your light bulb example, I mean, you know, one can also see that a lot of the old inefficient light bulbs have just been recategorized as sort of fancy retro light bulbs and so on. So, you know, and sort of, I mean, you know, so to some extent, you know, you get sort of these kind of interesting recategorization of inefficient technologies as sort of something different. And I think that is, you know, I don't know about the cordless vacuum cleaners, but I hesitate to wonder about whether, you know, this is not more successful political pressure to keep it off the list rather than a desperate search to find the standard, or it might be both, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think ultimately it's a challenge if a new type of technology becomes increasingly important, such as a good old cordless vacuum cleaner. You know, that's a standard setting, usually sort of tries to sort of catch up with changing consumer tastes and sort of dominant market products and so on. And I think there's sort of a general regulatory problem there.
Okay, Martin, you segued us nicely for, we've got a couple of minutes just to deal with our final topic, which is about light bulbs. And there's a couple of questions that folk are looking for a bit of help on. One is, so if we do eventually get to a position where we are all using LED light emitting display bulbs, what impact would that, environmental impact would that have, and how much of electricity does home lighting actually account for? So that's one issue people are looking for guidance for. The other is, well, why, when we initially banned incandescent light bulbs, did we then put up with the CFL bulbs, which A, everybody complained about not coming on, but B, also had this issue about the mercury content. Sue, I mean, you're able to help us at all on either of those, about how switching to LED might reduce our electricity consumption, and you know, why did we put up with the mercury CFL bulbs?
Well, I can on the first one. I mean, they use 90% less energy compared with the incandescent bulb. So there is a huge energy saving in using the LED light bulbs. I suspect it's just a case of technology evolving. So, you know, I think the shift initially was driving a reduction in energy use, but not necessarily the most effective light bulbs. There are still some technical issues we found, for example, that, you know, the different, the incandescent ones, you probably got better differences in terms of coloured lighting than you do at the moment. So I think there's still some ways that the lights can actually be improved for the way that people want to use them. But overall, it's just a massive saving in energy, and therefore also benefits you as a consumer in terms of the cost that you save from that as well.
Neil or Martin, do either want to come in on this one?
Just to echo the point we made earlier as well about standardization, you know, there's never one reason why regulations are introduced. There's always multiple competing tensions. And yes, it's about the eco-friendly side of it, but it's also about the standardization as well. Okay,
lovely. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you to Neil and to Sue and to Martin. Before we break out of this session and you go back into your breakout groups, let me just make one or two points, in a sense kind of responding to some of the questions that you raised. as a community of participants in debriefing last night. The first, of course, is that many of you are wondering, well, how many people are involved in this exercise? I've seen the half dozen or so people that I've been talking to intensely over the weekend. Well, the answer to you is that there's about 30 groups that have been taking part in this, and we've had just over 200 people taking part in this event during the course of the weekend, and we are of course extremely grateful to all of you for your participation. So yes, while your own experience has been within a small group, actually yes, you have been taking part in quite a large event. We did do something similar using Zoom last year. Then we had about 150 people. This one is even larger. So yes, this is part of a much a large event and a even larger community of people who've gone through this kind of deliberation during the course of the last 12 months or so. You've also been asking not unreasonably, well, what the devil was the point of this weekend? Why have we been sitting here and doing this? Well, you know, I'll be honest with you, in part, you know, we are academics, and yes, in part we're wanting to do academic research that will eventually occur in journals, but that's in truth is not the principal motivation. We're also interested in indeed actually having some, I mean, impact's the wrong word, at least, you know, adding information into the debate that we're having to have about various aspects of UK public policy now that we are leaving the European Union. And, you know, immigration obviously is one crucial area, but equally also agriculture and consumer regulation also clearly potentially affected. So because we started on this project last year and we've already done some of these weekends, we have in fact already been feeding the findings of our research in talks to various groups of civil servants, government social researchers, the Foreign Office, etc., as well as other organizations, including some business organizations. So the views that you express do eventually get across to some of those people who are at least responsible for advising ministers, though of course in the end it's ministers that make their own decision. And if you're interested in some of the things that we're finding out, actually it's going to be the case that on Thursday of this week, we will be publishing some of the initial findings, not so much of the deliberation that's happened over these kinds of weekends, but as some of you may be aware, you know, we've been doing surveys about these subjects amongst the general public as well. And we'll be reporting on some of the findings of the surveys on this subject we've been doing so far during the course of last year. If you want to find it, you'll be able to find it on either the What UK Thinks website, which you've been using in order to find out about this event, or indeed on the website of NATSEM, which has been organizing this event. So if you want to know what everybody else thinks about this subject, chance to find out more on Thursday. But finally, and most importantly of all, just a big, big thank you for all of you for taking part in this event. You are in the end the crucial participants, and we are grateful to all of you for being involved. You'll get a chance now to go back into your groups and to debrief with your monitors, including about the session we've had this morning. Can I just remind you, crucially, you will be asked to complete another survey. You would have done one before we started this weekend, do another survey in which, again, you'll be asked your views about the subjects that we've talked about. And this is a crucial bit for us if we're going to know what you think, having listened to people like Neil and Martin and Sue this morning, and all of the other people, as well as, of course, crucially, having had the chance to talk to some of your fellow citizens. Then we do please just ask you, before you pop off to Sunday lunch, a well-deserved Sunday lunch, that you just fill in that survey so that we know what you think by the end of the weekend. But so, from me, goodbye, and thank you a great deal, and now back to your moderators.